So somewhere around the end of each year, I like to tell people about the books I enjoyed most the previous year. But this year I delayed a bit, and then I finally made the following video about those books. But the next thing I knew, all of my energy was going into the coronavirus pandemic. And as more time passed, it didn't seem like the priority was a video about last year's reading. But now that everyone's been locked up in their homes for a few weeks, maybe it is time for some reading suggestions. So I'm taking a break from the pandemic to offer a video that I made ages ago in another reality before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. I hope you enjoy it. Read many books last year? I used to plow through a lot more until I descended into the time sink of video making. Although arguably I could have phrased that more positively. But I did manage to read some books in 2019, and I'm going to tell you about a few of my favorites. I've picked 3 fiction and 3 non-fiction books to talk about briefly. They're not all new books, although some of them are. They're just the books I enjoyed most in last year's reading. Maybe they'll give you some new reading ideas, or maybe there'll be a few names to cross off your list. Anyway, first the fiction. And for this first book, I have something to say directly to the author. I'm talking about Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. Okay, Mr. Rothfuss, I've now read the first 2 of your promised Kingkiller Chronicles trilogy. Beginning with The Name of the Wind. In fact, I was enough taken with that first book to have put it on my 2018 list, and to have read all 1,007 pages of the sequel, and to have placed that one too on my favorite reads of the year list. Your protagonist, Kvothe, has burnished a reputation as a larger-than-life master of magic and force of nature. He hides from his many enemies in a remote village under the guise of a tavern keeper, Kvothe, dictating his memoirs. He relates a childhood arc of promising but utterly alone young boy eking out a living on the streets among orphans to his goal of reaching the university. The second book takes off where the first ended, and I will stipulate that the world building in this pre-technical society is excellent, and the telling satisfying. But now we need to have a talk. Can we admit that this little venture of yours is not a trilogy? That given that Book 1 came out in 2007, and Book 2 in 2011, and that your readership has waited 8 years for the promised concluding volume, that there is good reason to suspect that you are having problems. That your second book, while enjoyable and admirable, didn't advance your central unfinished task one iota. That is, the telling of how Kvothe came to find himself as tavern owner in hiding, after a monumental and unrivaled career, having achieved a reputation for actions of world-altering significance. For you to conclude this tale would be an impressive, and after 8 years, surprising achievement. And in a single volume, to conclude the trilogy? Almost inconceivable. I don't see how we can avoid drawing the natural parallel to George R.R. Martin's well-known difficulties in concluding his even more famous fantasy series. You have taken on more than you knew when you began. Your story has expanded beyond expectations. Maybe yours is the story of recent ambitious fantasy. The threads sprawl in many directions. The sprawl begins to direct the story. You merely hitching along for the ride. Your creation has become your master. Where are you, Mr. Rothfuss? Tell me I'm wrong. Make me eat my words. The book is very engaging, by the way. The next book, and more concisely, is Eleander Morning by Jerry Yulsman. This one is an unexpected treat. Yulsman, a photojournalist by profession, wrote only 2 novels, which is a shame. He should have written more. For a book that begins with an assassination, that of young Adolf Hitler in 1913, I'm a little surprised to find myself describing this book as charming. The novel has an intriguing narrative structure, one of puzzles to be solved. But its charm comes in no small part from 2 captivating and enigmatic protagonists. The eponymous Eleander Morning, the assassin herself, and her granddaughter, to whom she bears a striking resemblance. The author, Mr. Yulsman, served in North Africa and Europe during World War II, devoting himself to defeating the Nazis. In this counterfactual world, an alternative history in which the Nazis never existed, he succeeds in that undertaking once again. The final book in the fiction category is Behind the Throne by K.B. Wagers. While this may not be transcendent science fiction, I definitely enjoyed it. The basic plot idea is that the black sheep of a royal family unexpectedly finds herself as heir to the throne after an evil cabal murders much of her family. The world building is well done, with the creation of a female-dominant society somehow derived from a Hindu historical background. That may sound odd, but I thought it worked well. The protagonist is a badass princess-cum-gunrunner who needs to step up to her duty, assuming a mantle that she never thought would be thrust upon her. Her mission and the first-person telling draw the reader in, and I was interested throughout. I just may read the sequel, even though I am notoriously not a completist. We have now arrived at the non-fiction portion of the program, and I'm first going to talk about Educated by Tara Westover. Now, this will do you a little good because I have an unfortunate habit of removing the covers from hardcover books and then trying to find them after and put them back on the book, and I wasn't successful in doing that this time. But Tara Westover begins her book by insisting that it is not about Mormonism, and she's right. There are fanatics and extremists of all stripes, kind and malevolent, disciples of all belief systems, and even those who reject religious beliefs. What Westover does in her book Educated is to communicate her story of growing up under the yoke of an odious physical and emotional abuse. The context is a family steeped in a rigid, intolerant fundamentalism. But the effect might be similar in any family environment in which a collective covenant, sealed like a sacred pact, conspires to protect its own perverse falsehoods. Much of the power of her story comes from one interpretation of the book's title. Westover grew up in a family that denied her a formal education. She was less homeschooled than part of the family labor pool in a scrap metal and herbal medicine business in a remote part of Idaho. In a meaning she might disavow, it feels like a redemption to hear of her educational journey. Her private study to pass the college entrance examination, her discovery of a previously unknown wider world at Brigham Young University, and her trajectory to Cambridge University where she's ultimately granted her PhD. Why might she disavow a redemptive interpretation of the word educated? There are other meanings of the word. Her task, becoming educated, involves something far more difficult than academic study. The obstacles before her are immensely greater. Facing an unbending family narrative, She seeks to undo the gaslighting, to learn to trust her own memories and perception, and to craft and believe her own truth about her family and her life. The price she pays for this deliverance is steep, but her efforts necessary and courageous. There are valuable lessons here at this historical moment, and it is a success in itself that sometimes stories like hers are no longer shrouded in darkness. We move on to The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli. This book is hard to describe. It does you little good to hear that it's written by one of the world's great scientist writers, and even less that he's one of the founders of the field of loop quantum gravity in theoretical physics. I could report to you that Rovelli has a genius for unification. He translates the challenging language of the science of time and grounds it in a philosophical perspective that is illuminating, poetic, rare, and rarefied. Rovelli's book grapples with the unbridgeable gap between what our science indicates and our myopic human understanding of reality. We extrapolate from our limited interactions with the world through brains little equipped for the task. And yet Rovelli renders our struggle into sublime poetry. But this too does you little good to hear. I recommend this book most highly. And I'll offer one quote, evocative of time, the author citing the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. Every day, countless people die, and those who remain live as if they were immortal. And finally, Origin Story, A Big History of Everything by David Christian. I was in love with Big History before it was formally inaugurated by David Christian in his book Maps of Time in 2004. Christian espoused in that book a view of history that I'd unknowingly held since I was a small child. That a history that starts with written language is a small one. That one that begins with the human career is only slightly larger. That a human-centric history is, in fact, parochial. Though Christian's work has motivated an academic discipline, he was far from the first nor the only exponent of its essentials. A very abbreviated list, if you're a lumper and not a splitter, might include Alexander von Humboldt, Carl Sagan, William McNeill, and Jared Diamond. Big History has since become incorporated into many high school curricula, influenced by Bill Gates, who was so gobsmacked that he founded the Big History Project with David Christian as a worldwide effort to promote teaching of the subject. Big History is history writ large. It incorporates all we know about the past, starting with the origin of the universe, through the formation of galaxies, solar systems, our planet Earth, the origin and evolution of life on Earth, human evolution, and eventually the human spread around the globe, and human society. It seeks universal patterns of explanation and is necessarily multidisciplinary. Origin Story is Christian's updated account of this discipline. And his claim is that Big History represents a modern creation story, a secular creation story. In this way of seeing things, a species-wide narrative of our origins is still being elaborated, is continuing to unfold, but its elements are visible. And if we are able to make the transition to a sustainable future, acknowledging that this is something far from certain, as human conflict aside, 10,000 years of unguided human geoengineering careen toward a global environmental confrontation. But if we are able to make that transition to a sustainable future, our distant descendants may well tell a creation story with recognizable affinity to the one that we are assembling today. That's the best of what I liked in my reading last year. Be sure to subscribe, hit the notification button to hear about future videos, and thanks a lot for watching.